So now we're going to talk about the effects on global warming. And obviously, global warming causes a warmer troposphere. And so warmer weather means that there's lots of benefits. We have less severe winters, more precipitation in dry areas, less precipitation in wet areas, and increased food production for a few reasons, which we'll talk about, such as an increased rate of photosynthesis due to warmer temperatures and more carbon dioxide. However, on the other hand, there's also disadvantages. So there's excessive heat, um, lack of water, and then a decreased food production because the places that are excessively hot, you have a decreased food production. And also in places where you have drought that wasn't before, is also going to affect your food production. And so, according to the International Panel on Climate Change, uh, the people and wildlife in the tropics are the ones that are going to suffer the most. So, if we look at the tropics at this map over here, right, this is a vulnerability index, and so you can see that these areas along the equator are the ones that are mostly blue, which have a high vulnerability to climate change. A lot of it has to do with sea level rise, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you're in a coastal area, obviously you're going to get affected by global warming quite a bit. And so, obviously, I'm sure everyone has heard that global warming melts ice and snow. And so the polar regions are experiencing larger increases of temperature. And this is because of the convection cells that we learned about before. And so if we were to look at the temperature changes around the world, right, globally, we've only changed zero point 0.8 degrees Celsius, but that's kind of a misleading number because you end up with areas in the Arctic that are like 4 degrees centigrade higher, where some places haven't changed at all. And there are some places more in the southern hemisphere that actually have gotten a little colder. So climate change is really a better term because the climates are changing, whereas global warming is noting, right, the entire global annual mean. And so that number, although seemingly not very high, can be high in places, which has a huge effect. And so you have this sea ice that melts due to increased temperatures. And, snow and ice have a very high albedo. And so it reflects about 90% of the sunlight back into space. Less sunlight is reflected when snow and ice are melting, which is warming the troposphere, which causes more snow and ice to melt, which reflects less sunlight, which warms it more. And so you have an amplified effect of this loop. And so we call this a positive feedback loop, right? Positive feedback loops are feedback loops that where the effects are amplified. And so, there's a difference between sea ice and land ice, and that's very, very important in terms of sea level rise. And so, you have this melting sea ice, and just like an ice cube in a glass, right when it melts, it's not actually going to change the level in the glass. So the water is already in the sea; it's just melting there. So it's just in a different state of matter. Whereas glaciers or land ice will raise sea level because this is land-based ice melting into the ocean. So it's ice that was not in the water, which is now melting and trickling down into surface waters. And so you also have this water that is going down through the crevices to the sediment underneath the glacier, and it's actually lubricating the underside of the glacier, which causes the glacier to fall into the sea even more. And so this is another positive feedback loop. And so because this ice was on land, it's actually right, it's actually adding to the pure volume of water in the ocean. and thereby raising the level of the ocean. And so here's a video. This is actually a documentary called Chasing Ice. I'm not going to play it now on this video, but go into the PowerPoint, play it on YouTube. It's actually quite an interesting calving event where it's a massive piece of a glacier is falling into the ocean. It's majestic and scary. So take a look. But I've been saying a little bit about sea level rise, and so it's exactly what it sounds like, is that sea level is rising, and they're projected to flood low-lying areas. And so it depends on how highly elevated you are. But if you look at this map here in our area, right, in the northeast coastline, you have these areas here in where you have Maryland and Delaware and southern New Jersey. Here's us in the Long Island Sound, very little bit of us, but still there, right? And so if you look at Florida and Houston here, I'm sorry, Houston's over there, right? And you have all of these Gulf states. Those are going to be highly affected by sea level rise. And, you know, there are projections as to how far sea level is actually going to rise. But, you know, even the slightest bit of sea level rise, like this 1 meter, will have quite a big effect. 6 meter is actually a very high projection. But the idea is that sea level is rising. People are going to get displaced because the most heavily populated areas are coastal. And so we're looking at quite a bit of displacement. And there are actually some areas where we have had climate change refugees, so people that have been forced to move due to climate change and sea level rise. And part of that is not just because their land is being covered by water, but also we have saltwater intrusion. And so when we talk about groundwater a little more, this might make more sense. But when sea level rises, you actually have a contamination of you can have a possible contamination of fresh water. And so there's no fresh water to drink, or very little fresh water to drink. You know, we need to move. So, and not to mention all of these really super, super important ecological areas that would be flooded over. And so obviously, ecologically, sea level rise can have a huge impact. And so our projections is that sea level rises anywhere from 9 to 88 centimeters during this century. And so, like I said, it's a pretty large range. You know, here are the different companies or projection models, and, you know, with a little bit of uncertainty either way. Seeing how much our sea level will rise. But, you know, like I said, models, right? Models are based off of information we have. And so we can have, you know, high projections up here. We can have low projections down here and anything in between. And so these sea level rises are actually super important, like I said before. And, you know, you'd think that those melting glaciers adding to the ocean levels are actually the cause of sea level rise. But in fact, they're only about 1/3 of the cause of sea level rise. The other 2/3 of sea level rise is due to thermal expansion. And so water has very funky properties. And so water expands when it's cold, and water can also expand as it's warmed up to a certain temperature. And so as water is warming, those molecules are actually getting a little further apart from each other, which is causing the actual volume of water to change. And so this is the main part of sea level rise. So 2/3 of sea level rise is due to this thermal expansion. And we're going to stop right there with this video, if I can figure out how to stop it, and we will move on to the next.